At approximately 1610 on August 29, 1985, 73 firefighters were forced to deploy their fire shelters when the Butte fire on the Salmon National Forest in Idaho made a high-intensity crown fire run up the Wallace Creek drainage. They remained in their shelters approximately 1.5 hours as the fire burned intensely on all sides of their 2 safety zones. 5 firefighters suffered heat exhaustion and dehydration and were hospitalized overnight for treatment and observation. All were released the next day. All other firefighters escaped injury due to the protection provided by their fire shelters and instructions from the crew bosses and fire line overhead. The Butte fire was started by lightning on July 20th, 1985, and was initially contained on August 5th at just over 20,000 acres. Strong winds caused the fire to jump control lines on August 24th and 25th. Fire behavior activity peaked on August 27th, 28th, and 29th as the fire made significant runs of 1,000, 2,000, and 3,500 acres respectively. About 3,000 of the 3,500 acres spread on August 29th occurred in about 90 minutes. It was during this run up the Wallace Creek drainage that 73 firefighters deployed their shelters. Topography in the lower part of the fire was characterized by a heavily dissected rolling landform. Wallace Creek itself is a well-defined north-south drainage that becomes progressively steeper near the 2 shelter deployment sites. Elevations of the fire ranged from 6,400 feet near the confluence of Wallace and Owl Creeks to 8,200 feet near the 2 safety zones. Fuels in the lower parts of the Wallace Creek drainage were primarily spruce and fir, while higher up they were mostly lodgepole pine and fir. The weather August 29th was not unusual. Afternoon temperatures were in the mid-70s and minimum relative humidities were in the upper teens. Low-level winds were out of the south at 8 to 12 miles per hour in the afternoon, with occasional gusts of 17 to 20 miles per hour. The type of run observed in the upper Wallace Creek on August 29th was not unusual for lodgepole pine fires that occurred throughout the northern Rocky Mountains during the 1985 fire season. These high-intensity fire runs were the result of extremely low fuel moistures. Under these conditions, surface fires quickly made the transition to torching, spotting, and crowning. Bill Williams, Operations Section Chief on the Butte fire, sums up what happened on the afternoon of August 29th.
Okay, well basically on the incident that we had where the shelters were used, we had been trying with indirect attack in close for 2 days and had been unsuccessful. So we backed off to the main ridge on Wallace and Owl Creeks and built dozer line with adequate safety zones, we felt, and we're trying to get indirect there and get back far enough to give us time to complete that line and burn it out. The day that the burnover happened, we had an entire division out there working on that line, preparing it for burnout. When the fire made its big run, which caught us all by surprise, it traveled approximately 2 miles in about 15 minutes. We estimated 320 change per hour rate of spread. Obviously, being caught in the position we were with an entire division in front of that run was not what was intended. We actually intended to pull anybody out from in front of anything. We just didn't have time. By the time we knew we had a problem, it was too late to move anybody, and the only chance they had was to move into the safety zones on the ridge that were built with the tractors and to use their shelters. There were 118 people total that were in the path of the fire, an entire division. Some of those folks were in a large clear cut and they weathered it all right without using their shelters, although it was hot and smoky. There were 73 shelters deployed in 2 different locations. They had intense fire with complete crowning and total burn in heavy timber all the way around those safety zones. And I think the point is that the shelters do work because the fire had to be very intense. It burned the handles out of the shovels that the people were laying beside the shelters, and they're in the safety zones. So, and we've recovered a lot of those with the handles burned completely out of the head of the shovel. So it was a very intense fire. It was a long duration of heat, well over an hour. And yet, out of all those folks, even though some of the shelters cracked when they were deployed, they had holes in them, some of them weren't in the best of repair, there was not one burn, even a minor one, in all of the 73 people that did deploy their shelters. So I think that tells us that they do work and that it is important that we keep them in good repair and that everybody has one. There's no way that we can guarantee when we put people out anywhere close to a large fire that they won't need that shelter, and that's why I believe in them 100%.
5 crews were assigned to work along the ridgeline at the head of Wallace Creek. The Payson Hotshots and Flagstatt Hotshots, both Type 1 crews from Arizona. The Carson Hotshots, a Type 1 crew from New Mexico. The Flamingos, a Type 2 crew made up of inmates from the Utah prison system. And the Jemez Eagles, a Type 2 crew from New Mexico. Several overhead, dozer operators, and fallers were also working in the area. Their fire assignment on August 29th was to complete the dozer line around the head of Wallace Creek and backfire all of Wallace Creek within control lines. Fire line on the Butte fire was constructed to the width of 5 to 6 dozer blades with safety zones every 1/4 mile along the line. As the wildfire crowned to the north up Wallace Creek and approached the dozer lines on the ridge, all 5 crews pulled back into safety zones. The Payson and Flagstaff crews used a large clear-cut area 1/4 mile to the east of Tin Cup Hill and did not have to deploy their shelters. The Carson Hotshots deployed their shelters in a safety zone located on the top of Tin Cup Hill, which measured 400 feet long by 275 feet wide. The Jemez Eagles and the Flamingos deployed their shelters in a safety zone 1/4 mile west of the Tin Cup Hill safety zone. This zone measured 300 feet long by 300 feet wide. Fred Schoeffler, superintendent of the Payson Hotshots, recalls what he saw from the safety zone in the clear cut as the fire approached the Tin Cup Hill area.
There was just a wall of fire from maybe drop point 28 all the way over to 29 coming up to the north. And the best I could describe it was just a wall of fire with, it wasn't a typical crown fire. It was coming very, very rapidly. Just a reddish, orange, gaseous, rolling fire with huge gas balls coming off in flame heights of maybe 200 feet.
Looking back over towards Carson on Tin Cup Hill, we could see that Carson Hotshots were going to take a good dose of that wall of flame. At that point in time, we didn't, we were at a point where we had talked about moving back farther into the clear cut, back up the hill farther. We did that, moved back to the dozer line and moved farther up the hill, and as we watched the wall of flame come out of the trees and into the clear cut, that dirty red-orange glow just seemed to roll over the treetops.
Several of the firefighters who deployed their fire shelters recall what happened as the fire overran them.
We got up to this safety zone. We heard the fire roaring up the canyon, smoke coming toward us. So we, strike team leader and myself, suggested that we'll do a little burnout. We started the burnout right along in here, which you only consume about 25 to 30 feet, maybe about 300 feet wide. By that time, we figured the fire was gonna overtake us. I called the crew back up to where the shelters are at, and from there, we hesitated for a little bit, looked at the situation over. We knew we had to break shelter. I passed the word to everybody to get their shelters ready, and they broke them within 5 to 10 seconds or so, or sooner than that. After that, the ball of fire hit us in there, and we stood in there behind the cat. We must have stayed there about half an hour, and before the main fire went over, once it went over from this side, we were pretty close to the other line, and I started to feel some heat from the back. So I got my shelter and looked up, and I could see more flames behind me. At this time, I instructed my crew by radio to move forward, which we did. Some of them crawled, some of them got up on their shelter and put them on their shelter in the back. They went about 15 feet, lay down again. I asked them if everybody was okay. The response from my crew boss, he said they were all okay. So it was still getting a little hotter, so we waited there about another 15, 20 minutes. We had to move again about another 20 or 25 feet. So altogether, we were on those shelters about an hour, 45 minutes to an hour. The heat was pretty extensive in there, unbelievable. The winds were, I don't know how hard they were blowing, but they had to be over 100 miles an hour, 80, 100 miles an hour. You could barely do anything but to hold that shelter in there. Another thing that I experienced in there, that people, for some reason, I had a radio and they were following me. Afterwards, they came up in there that they heard the radio talking. They figured if somebody was talking on the radio, they were safe enough. About an hour later, when the smoke was kind of clearing up a little bit and the heat kind of went down a little bit, I tried to get a head count out of all the people, but I tried it 3-4 times and couldn't get it because the smoke kept coming. But between in there and the first time we moved, there were a lot of screaming inside the fire shelters. We're gonna make it, screaming, yelling, and it was pretty bad in there.
As soon as the wall of flame came up, that's when we snapped them open, every one of us. So we got down on the ground, and all we can hear was that roaring sound like a freight train, a jet plane or something coming over, about 10 feet above us. We got under our shelters. We started talking to each other. And all you can see underneath there was bright orange, just like you had painted the ground orange. And trying to hold on to that shelter is like trying to hold on to something that's being pulled from above you. You can't hold on to it. You just can't stay down. Seems like yourself was you were weightless. You were rising off the ground. You can just feel it. I think that was the most scary part about the whole thing, most frightening. Well, we were talking to each other, but as far as I can say, or my crew, my part of the crew, or I can say this for myself, is when we got under there, when the fire really got bad, we weren't talking about the fire or is everybody okay, can you make it, nothing like that. We changed the whole thing, we changed the whole fire subject. We were talking about somebody else, about something else, about what that guy did that time with her or him or whatever. Where you were found with his other girlfriend, stuff like that, to build up our morale. We changed the whole thing, we changed the whole subject. I can say that part is, I think that helped, in keeping us alive. I can say that much for that. We just didn't want to think about the fire when it was going over us, when it was above us, around us, everywhere. But that was, I've been in firefighting for 20 years, and that had been the most frightening, scary experience I've ever had. I can say that for myself. I have never been through anything like that. And I was in Vietnam for a year, but this beats it all.
We were literally running up this cat line with drip torches, lighting a fire behind us. And when fusees, with fusees too. And I remember we got to a point where we couldn't stay down there any longer. We all threw our fusees in the woods and ran down here where you can see the shelters. And I looked around to make sure my crew was popping their shelters, no one was running, and that everybody made sure they had gloves on, and that they were getting in their shelters, and as calmly as they could, trying to keep them calm. And the last thing I remember seeing before I went in was a wall of flame across this cat line, as far as I could see either way, into the smoke, and about 200, 300 feet high. Just all you could see was flame. And I ducked in my shelter. And when I got my shelter out, I ripped off my web gear, threw it down, got the shelter, and got inside, so I was separated from my water and a radio. I had this radio on my chest, and I could talk to my crew, and I made sure I could talk with them, make sure they were okay, try to calm them down as much as I could, and make sure that, well, we were trying to find who was around them, get a count of everybody by yelling, communicate in between shelters, and we got a fairly good count. Made sure everybody was okay. You could look out underneath your shelter, and it was just a bright red, and it'd glow. My shelter had holes in it, and it would project the light through the shelter onto the inside, and you could tell when it was getting, extremely hot, that the color would change from like an orange color to just a bright intense red, and all you could do was just lay there and hold it down. The smoke inside the shelter was at that time started getting bad. I could hear guys yelling that there was holes in their shelters, and that they were having trouble breathing, and we were just trying to keep calm, use a handkerchief, hold it over your mouth, and stay calm and breathe shallow, even breaths, as much as we could. Pretty soon the fire had jumped the line and come around and started in back of us, and we didn't see it, but you could tell, you could feel the heat change from, mostly in front of you to the back of you. And it was at that time we made the first move, and we moved from where the shelters are now a little bit about to the center of the safe area. And the fire flared up just as intense as it had in front of us, and it was now in back of us. And it just seemed like it was above us, in front of us, everywhere at that time. When it had died down in front of us a little bit, we made another move, and we moved up closer to this side, where it was, after it had cooled down, just trying to get away from the heat. After that, after the fire had died down a little more in back of us, and that was probably about, I don't know, I wasn't watching the clock, but I'd say it was about a half hour that we were in there with the just intense flame. The rest was a real thick smoke that just made it extremely difficult to breathe. And that was one of the bigger problem to me, was dealing with the smoke rather than the heat. The shelter worked really well, keeping the heat out. And for the rest of the time, we were, I think, in our shelters about an hour and a half. And the rest of the time was just trying to keep low and keep out of the smoke as much as we could. When we made our second move, I was able to go back, get my web gear, and get my water. And for the rest of the time I was in there, I just sipped on my canteen, and the water really helped. The handkerchief over the mouth, and they say dry, not wetted down with any water. That helped a lot too. It helped you breathe quite a bit. The water helped you from being dehydrated, which one of the guys that was injured down in here the hospital said that he was quite dehydrated, and that was whether it was due to not having water in the shelter or not drinking it enough on the line. Definitely keep your water with you. When the winds that were created from the fire, the front, hit us, it would lift this shelter almost right up off you. People were having hot sparks and embers blowing in underneath, and when they'd go to swat them out or knock them off themselves, it would cause the shelter to lift up off them, and they'd have to hold it back down again. These holes you can see in here, there was hot embers and sparks blowing through. Every time you'd move, it seemed like the hole would rip a little bit bigger every time. We made 2 moves, and every time I'd move mine, my hole in mine started out maybe 6 inches, and it ended up about a foot. Could stick my head through it by the end of the ordeal. People would use their radios too. They have to take their hands off the edge of the shelter and to key their radio to talk to somebody that's sheltered, try to blow away on them. One of the most important things that came out of this was that even though there are holes in these shelters, that they still worked. There was ways to get around. If the hole was on the bottom, you could tuck it under you, or you could try to hold it shut. Or these little ones, you could feel the heat coming through, but you could move far enough away where it wouldn't hurt you. Even though the shelter was in bad shape, it still saved lives.
This is the worst burn that I've ever seen come up at me. I'd been burned over before, but I've never had to get in a shelter before. But there was no doubt in my mind when this was coming that we had to go into a shelter, because it was just rolling, and then the winds was tremendous. And while we was in the shelters, them things was picking up, and it was almost picking us up. It was almost all we could do to hold the shelters down. And then it'd pick up, and then it would drop right back down onto us. And it was hitting my legs, and it was hot, and I wanted to move, but I knew I couldn't do it. And then the wind would come up again, pick it up again, and then to slam it back down on you. And you kind of felt helpless at that time. One thing about it is there was a lot of, pinholes or small cracks in the shelter. And as the fire was burning over you, you could look up and just see a bright orange glow. And when the fire stopped, it just got dark. And you couldn't see, and then the other storm would hit you, and it'd be a bright orange glow. There was no doubt in my mind of when the flames was over us, that it got real hot. And what we did, we got to the north side of the ridge. The front was coming at us from the south, and we positioned ourselves on the downhill side of that clear-cut area, or safety zone. And when that hit, it jumped over us and started burning behind us. We scooted our shelters up away from the hot spots. And I think in my group, we had moved the shelters about 3 times we just kind of slid along the ground to keep them going. As we were in the shelter for the initial burn, there was no conversation at all. As it calmed down a little bit, then the Carson crew started talking, and everybody started talking, and that seemed to help matters out a lot, to know that you weren't alone up there. And then we was down, because we had 3 separate storms come over us. We had one from the front, one from the rear, and one from the side. And you wasn't sure when it was going to end. And when we did the storms finally stopped, we kind of raised up and looked, but the smoke was so heavy we had to stay in the shelter probably for, I would guess, around an hour or something like that. And when it finally cleared off, we had contact with the crews at the bottom of us, and they were still in the shelters, and it seemed like everybody was okay. And we come out of our shelters, and there was still a lot of smoke, and we just kind of had to set up there and wait until we could get some transportation out of there.
preceding the fire coming over us, there is quite a blast of air, of wind, somewhere between 30 and 40 miles an hour. So you'll have, we experience some difficulty as far as getting into the shelters while you're faced with that kind of wind. I found it was a little better to open the shelter and get my feet in the straps while standing up with my back to the wind and pulling the shelter up over, then going down in a crouch and laying down. There was a lot of problem on keeping the seal inside the shelter. People were calling on the radio with obvious concerns. I happened to have gone down with the radio underneath me, and every time I'd reach down for the radio, there'd be another blast of wind that would come in through a hole that I allowed to come through while reaching for the radio. So I gave up on that and just decided to ignore the radio until things calmed down. We did get hit 3 times. I was aware of the fact we'd get hit from the front and from the back. The third blast was kind of unexpected. And while in the shelter, you can expect winds in the 40 to 50 mile an hour range. While we were in there, it did get hot. Gloves were an absolute necessity as far as being able to hold the sides of the shelter down. In the strong winds, the shelter's going to flap. It's going to come down right over your head, and it's going to hit your back. It didn't seem to make any difference as far as its effectiveness. After the third blast, things calmed down quite a bit, and the crew boss of the Carson Hotshots was the first one out, reassuring everybody that things were okay. People did start coming out of the shelters, and when I came out, it was apparent that there was still a lot of smoke and a lot of heat and a lot of fumes. So I had everyone go back into the shelters for probably another 30, 40 minutes. I noticed a few people, when they moved, they stood straight up and just shuffled their feet. And in doing that, the bottom part of the shelter would catch on rocks and root stubs, and they were tearing the bottom of the shelter. So as I moved up, I went ahead and reached down between my legs and grabbed the flap at the bottom, pulled it up between my legs, and kind of went into a crouch. And at the same time, you're still experiencing the winds from that fire. And I had to turn with my back to the wind to keep the shelter on my back and around me. Otherwise, it would catch the shelter, billow it out like a sail, and shift it around to one side.
The main thing that really shocked me was how much turbulence, the wind. It wanted to rip your shelter right off. You know, you really had to concentrate and keep that shelter down. The heat was not real bad here. The smoke was pretty bad. I was fortunate to have a good enough shelter. Mine had very few holes in it, so there was no problem there. During the time, though, everybody was really scared because you didn't know what to expect. I think that was probably the worst thing about it, was just really didn't know what to expect. Once we were down and it hit us, we were pretty much talking to each other after it hit us, because when it did hit us, the noise was it was tremendous. It was like all these jets just flying over you. So we were all just talking to each other, trying to get our mind off the fire and joking around as much as we could. Everybody knew, though, that it was pretty serious. It was definitely a life and death matter.
When I landed, the smoke and everything was still very, very thick. I had trouble seeing and breathing myself just getting down the hill. I think probably the most welcome sight I had was seeing all the faces looking at me and realizing that everyone was pretty much all right. The gentleman that was having the difficulties was in good hands. They did good first aid, and I had Mike Parsons off the Carson Hotshots, who is an EMT, fly with the gentleman into the helicopter. We had to load him onto the cat and take him on up the hill to where the helicopters were. Most of the personnel appeared to be in good spirits. Due to the carbon monoxide and smoke, they were having some shortness of breath, and we were at the point where we had to walk them out. We made them leave all their equipment behind and had it piled to be picked up later. We made a very slow walk out along the cat line down to the drop point. Along that time, I discovered that I had about 3 more personnel that were having some problems. I did have to administer oxygen to quite a few personnel along the way. Mainly, it was just keeping everybody in good spirits. They were talking and laughing a lot and pretty glad to be alive. We got them down to the buses and vans and transportation and took them on into the spike camp.
The entrapment incident on the Butte fire proves that the fire shelters do work, and they work even in circumstances of heavy fuels and a lot of extreme heat, and even when they're maybe not in the best of repair with cracks and so on. So the important thing to get out of this is that all of our fire line people have to have the shelters, they have to carry them on the line, and they have to know how to use them. And then there's a caution that I'd like to throw out that we don't get overconfident in our shelters, that we remember that they're not an escape route, that they are a last resort, and they're something that you use when everything else has failed. And I still think that the best fire shelter is one that never has to be used.
I'm still here. After what happened, what I went through, I'm still here because of that fire shelter.
They saved my life and they saved the lives of my crew. I think when I die, I'll go to heaven because I spent my time in hell right down there.
So whatever you do, take care of that shelter. Don't walk around the woods without it. You save our life, you might save yours.